it could be said that Jodrell Bank might have picked up pre-recorded audio and video from an unmanned craft that was already on the lunar surface or in lunar orbit, but the question remains, how could Jodrell Bank have picked up Apollo's signal? These radio transmissions were done at 2 GHz, which is 2000 MHz. And by Pritchard's admission, Jodrell Bank's telescope was only tuned to 2300 MHz. As anyone driving a car would know, to listen to your favourite radio station, your antenna must be tuned to the right frequency. It is the same case with tracking vehicles from space. The dish must be precisely tuned to the correct frequency, otherwise you will pick up no signal. Just to confirm what I already knew, I replied to Morrison asking him to confirm whether or not the USSR depended on the Lovell telescope to track their own lunar craft. My message was ignored. I wonder why. What could Jodrell Bank possibly know? Well, if you recall, Bill Kaysing and Ralph Renee respectively picked up on a book entitled Journey to Tranquility. In it, we find that during a visit to Moscow in 1963, Sir Bernard Lovell was informed that the Russians could see no immediate way of protecting cosmonauts from the lethal effects of solar radiation.
I had frequently asked my Soviet contacts when they intended to send a human being to the moon, and their response was always, when we can be absolutely certain of getting them back alive. And they did not believe that the Americans would do this. And in fact, it's pretty clear that the Americans did take considerable risk.
Evidently, it seems that neither the Russians nor the amateur radio operators had the means or resources to verify the origin of Apollo's signal, despite the insistence of propagandists.
The Soviets had mustered all their technical know-how to build the probe, but to score the propaganda coup of reaching the moon first, there was one thing they lacked. They had no means of tracking Lunik all the way. No way to prove they'd really got there.
Just to track their own moonbound craft, the USSR relied on the technology of a British observatory, whose telescope they used to track Apollo put them in the same mess as the radio hams. We all know that the propagandists love to cite the Russians and radio telescopes as proof that the missions were real. Ironically, the propagandist's number one piece of evidence can be used to invalidate their number one source. As the BBC told us previously,
it began with Lunik 2.
But what about Luna 1? On Jodrell Bank's website, we are told, a telegram dated May 8, 1959, from Professor Lovell was sent to the Committee on Science and Astronautics of the U.S. House of Representatives and its Special Subcommittee on the Lunar Probe set up to investigate the claim by author Lloyd Malin in his book The Big Red Lie that the first Soviet lunar probe was a hoax. We did not succeed in detecting any signals from Lunik. Search was made with the large telescope over the frequency band covering 183.6 megacycles, which was the stated tracking frequency during the night of January 3 to January 4th, when Lunik was said to be close to the moon. No tracking errors could account for failure, because the telescope beam was adequate to cover position of probe at time of close approach. Telescope was in similar operational condition, which has enabled us to track Pioneer 400,000 miles. We concluded that the Lunik was not transmitting continuously, at least not on this frequency, during that night. An alternative conclusion could be that the Luna 1 never existed. The US government had the telemetry to prove it. And yet, they let the USSR get away with it. Why?
Well, I'll tell you, at the highest levels, there's a coalition between governments. In other words, the Soviets said, if you won't tell on us, and they faked most of their space exploits, we won't tell on you. It's as simple as that.
Finally, it should also be noted that signals can and have been relayed through space. Radio frequencies that go all the way up to 60 GHz reach what is called the oxygen absorption band, meaning that our planet's thick atmosphere effectively absorbs the electromagnetic waves. In fact, the US government takes full advantage of this for use in covert satellite-to-satellite communications.
Point-to-point wireless systems operating at 60 GHz have been used for many years by the intelligence community for high-security communications and by the military for satellite-to-satellite communications. Their interest in this frequency band stems from a phenomenon of nature. The oxygen molecule absorbs electromagnetic energy at 60 GHz like a piece of food in a microwave oven. This absorption occurs to a much higher degree at 60 GHz than at lower frequencies typically used for wireless communications. This absorption weakens 60 GHz signals over distance, so that signals cannot travel far beyond their intended recipient. For this reason, 60 GHz is an excellent choice for covert satellite-to-satellite communications because the Earth's atmosphere acts like a shield, preventing Earth-based eavesdropping.
And guess what? This technology was already well underway by the late 60s. Theoretically, an Earth-orbiting Apollo craft could have transmitted these 60 GHz signals to an unmanned translunar craft. This vehicle could repeat the signal it received, but at 2 GHz. To prevent the inevitable blackout that would occur when the CSM went behind the Earth, a geosynchronous relay satellite would be required to repeat or reflect Apollo's signal to the translunar probe. Because the original signal can't penetrate the atmosphere, never would anyone know that the translunar signals were in fact relayed from Earth orbit. Of course, the propagandists may ask, how did NASA sneak these unmanned probes into orbit? Strangely, I don't hear them asking, how did the Russians smuggle Yuri Gagarin into space?
Soon, Gagarin is orbiting above a sleeping America, its citizens unaware of the communists' triumph.
How did the Russians smuggle Cosmos 954 into space?
The debris was recovered on Great Slave Lake, 300 kilometers east of Yellowknife. This cylinder, though not radioactive, will intrigue scientists. It's made of 3 metals and could tell them more about Soviet satellite construction. Armed Forces Film did not record the second fragment picked up nearby. But on return to Yellowknife last night, it was revealed that object was radioactive.
This 1978 Soviet crash came as a shock. The satellite didn't even exist on the United Nations register.
How did they manage to smuggle the LK into orbit? And how did the world lose Proton 4? Or was that Apollo 11 in Earth orbit? At the end of the day, the Apollo spacecraft broadcasted its signals on a frequency not used by radio hams. Russia lacked the ability to track their own moonbound craft and thus relied on Jodrell Bank to do it for them. And Jodrell Bank's one telescope that they used to track the Apollos was not tuned to the frequency used by the Apollo spacecraft. Subsequently, the only radio telescopes tracking Apollo were the ones owned by NASA. At the end of the day, the moon itself is indeed able to reflect lasers back to Earth. without the aid of any man-made reflectors. And thanks to ESA's Smart 1, we know the Apollo samples do not match up with actual moon rocks.
By punching a 10-metre hole in the moon's surface, the probe has uncovered minerals different to the rocks gathered on the surface during moonwalks.
Sadly, these three elements are still cited as the ultimate proof that men went to the moon. And until NASA can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that 24 of its astronauts went to the moon, the entire world's population has every right to believe otherwise.